Good morning, everybody. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. It is 9:30 and it is September 8th, and this is our weekly meeting. We will start with a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez. Commissioner Hackett.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 6 out of 7 commissioners present.
Great. Thank you very much. Good to see everybody. I see folks are scrolling into our meeting. Go over the agenda real quick. We'll start with public comment. Then we'll have a staff presentation on wildlife compensatory mitigation, a second staff presentation on inspection prioritization, consent agenda, and finish up with commissioner comments. Before we roll into public comment, do any commissioners have anything they would like to start out with before we move into public comment? Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very briefly, I just wanted to note that on Friday during deliberations, I misstated something related to jurisdictional issues of other agencies. I stand by the conclusion that I came to with respect to COGCC's jurisdiction over the particular matter that was brought to us through front range nesting bald eagle studies. But I had written this correctly in my notes, but even with it in front of me, I somehow misstated that what I intended to say was that bald eagles are no longer listed under the Endangered Species Act and therefore don't require consultation. However, they are still protected under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, as well as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And those are both under the jurisdiction of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so I just wanted to clarify that because I realized that I misstated that and wanted to note that there are still protections for bald eagles. So that was it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa, for that clarification. The record will also be reflected. With that, we turn to public comment. We have 3 written comments that were lodged into the record, one from Heidi Leithwood, one from Kate Christensen, and one from Ann Johnson. And we only had one person sign up for public comment, so we will be hearing from that one person. I see that she's in our Zoom meeting, and that is Tricia Fanning. So if we could elevate Ms. Fanning to the panel, we will give her 3 minutes for public comment.
Perfect. Can you hear me?
We can hear and see you.
Perfect. Good morning, commissioners. My name is Tricia Fanning, and I'm here to speak today on behalf of Small Operators Society. I would like to comment on an aspect of the issues to be determined in docket number 201-100-261, while not speaking to the specific of the operator's alleged conduct or factual matters. SOS members are concerned about staff's claims regarding what may be considered by the commission, a hearing officer, or ALJ, when a pattern of violations under Rule 525 is alleged by staff, as this would be an unwarranted departure from the rule's provisions, the Commission's own enforcement guidance and penalty policy, and former Commission practice. Rule 525D limits the COGCC's consideration of an operator's history of violations to, quote, violations confirmed by Commission order through administrative orders of consent or orders finding violation. Criteria that would be used by the Commission and the Director to evaluate a pattern of violations are listed in Rules 525D3. The Director will only consider OFEs and AOCs.
Fanning, excuse me. The matter that you're speaking to is an ongoing matter that the Commission will still be deliberating in a couple of weeks. And we've not allowed anyone else to provide comment relevant to that. And my Attorney General has indicated that the public comment that you're attempting to provide is not appropriate at this time. So we will have to stop you at this point. Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Yes, you may. And I would have Ms. Mercer be ready to answer any question.
Perfect. So if I'm not speaking to the matter and factual matters or anything with regards to the substance of the allegations, but I'm speaking to the matter from how of which determinations are being made on behalf of operators of the state, that's not allowed?
AAG Davenport, who's our counsel of record for this matter.
Thank you, Chair. At least in my view, Ms. Fanning is speaking directly to an issue that the Commission still has to decide. That is the scope of a pattern of violation. What may be considered in a pattern of violation. And so while I recognize Ms. Fanning may not be speaking directly to any of the specifics, it's still a question that the Commission has yet to decide and has to decide in the KPK matter.
Thank you, AAG Davenport. With that, I am going to sustain my objection to this line of inquiry. I'm very cognizant that this matter is very litigious, and we want to make sure that we afford all parties appropriate due process. So, Ms. Fanning, with all due respect, I appreciate your work, and I think you know that, and this has nothing to do with you personally. It just has to do with ensuring that I've got a good record for that other matter. So,
I understand. I don't take it personally at all. I appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. With that, we can allow Ms. Fanning to leave the panel, and we will be done with public comment for this morning, noting that we had the 3 written public commenters that have made it into the public record. With that, we will move to our next agenda item, which is a staff presentation on Wildlife Compensatory Mitigation Program update. I believe that Mr. Brett Ackerman, Southeast Regional Manager for CPW, and Karen Volterra, Southeast Energy Liaison for CPW, should be brought to the panel, and they will be leading us in this panel discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. I assume you can hear me okay?
We can hear you, at least in my regard. You seem fairly quiet. Maybe if you could turn up your microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope that is better, but I will try to speak up so that you can hear me. Please let me know if I'm too faint to hear.
Yeah, that is better, but do enunciate, because I want to make sure everybody is able to hear you very well.
I will do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I'm grateful to be with you here today. As the chairman noted, I'm Brett Ackerman. I am the Southeast Regional Manager for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and it's nice to be before this commission again. With me is Dr. Karen Volterra, the Southeast Energy Liaison and Land Use Specialist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife as well, and she's here to provide some depth and honestly to answer the hard questions that you may have. Appreciate Dr. Volterra being here with us this morning as well. We do have just a few notes and a short presentation for you on the compensatory mitigation program with regard to the wildlife rules. As you'll recall, Senate Bill 19-181 initiated a rulemaking process pertaining to a lot of things, but also pertaining to wildlife. And we spent the better part of 2020 discussing and meeting and writing rules associated with wildlife. And part of that was a semi-new compensatory mitigation program. And so we wanted to give you an update on that today. We've been working on that since the time of those rules and have finalized a compensatory mitigation administrative procedure within Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Wanted to provide an update to the commission today. So, compensatory mitigation, as we noted in the hearings, had been done previously on some projects with the Oil and Gas Commission, well, really with operators. And in the end, it was just ad hoc, and part of the rules were the finalization, or really the standardization, of compensatory mitigation with regard to wildlife and oil and gas operators. So, like I mentioned, upon passage of those rules, CPW worked quickly to establish procedures to administrate the program. And if you'll give me the next slide, please. Karen, are you able to advance to the next slide? There we go. Thank you. Appreciate that. So just as a reminder, compensatory mitigation as per the rules is required in a subset of big game and grouse high priority habitats. And we'll pop a map up here in a second so you can take a look at that. But essentially, the intent is an opportunity to offset both direct and indirect adverse impacts while adhering to the old standard of first avoid, second minimize, and third mitigate. And so after avoidance and minimization efforts have been made, the compensatory mitigation rules kick in, and CPW ultimately makes a recommendation to this commission for compensatory mitigation on a project by project basis. Just a reminder that there is a waiver process in play in the regulations where, based on writing and based on our assessment of unavoidable adverse impacts, for example, if a well is, right next to a road or in the middle of other disturbed habitat or a variety of other issues that would require waiver of compensatory mitigation requirements, that also is held within the regulations. Next slide, Karen. Thank you. So this is a map, again, as a reminder, you've seen these maps before, but this is a map of the high priority habitat layers that trigger compensatory mitigation consultation. And there are really two broad categories, and one is big game species and the other are grouse species. And so you can see that in this list, these are the general habitat types that trigger consultation for compensatory mitigation. And they are the most important life cycle habitats for the most impacted big game species in Colorado and the most impacted grouse species in Colorado. Thanks, Karen. Next slide. I also wanted to note that with regard to high priority habitats, essentially they're layers where impacts have been demonstrated to be influenced by facility density, and habitat treatments or conservation easements or something else can successfully mitigate those impacts. CPW has been working on this program and the administrative kind of setup of this program throughout late 2020 and into 2021, and essentially wanted to just kind of outline some of the principles that we've set forth as to what we'll look at with regard to the program, and really some of our guiding principles. And the first is, we talked about, to borrow a term from GOCO, we talked about a substantially equal philosophy. And the intent there was to ensure that dollars coming into the mitigation program were being spent on mitigation projects, both with regard to timing and with regard to areas for which mitigation is paid. So for example, CPW has 4 administrative regions, roughly split up into 4 quadrants of the state. And if dollars come in the Northwest region, the analysis will ensure that those dollars are in a substantially equal number of dollars are being spent in the Northwest region over time. Now, we wanted to do this over time to ensure that we were able to pool funds or move into statewide priorities from time to time if necessary. And sometimes you'll do an ecosystem level project or a larger habitat project that might require pooling of funds and movement of funds across borders. But in the end, the intent is to ensure that over time, a substantially equal amount that comes into a program per region is spent on habitat projects that impact the affected species in that region. Another guiding principle was that habitat work was to be the foundation of this program. The large amount of mitigation that would be done in the form of habitat projects. But we also left ourselves flexibility to consider other options, such as participation in larger habitat cooperative efforts, easements if appropriate, maybe even acquisitions if they're appropriate to mitigate. And as we talked about during the hearings, the ability to spend dollars to study the impacts of oil and gas development on specific species as determined to be appropriate where the data is lacking. We also built the program on a principle of transparency to the Oil and Gas Commission, to operators, and to the public. And we'll talk about each of those in a little more detail here in just a second. If you would, Karen. Thank you. The intent of the program, again, is largely to do habitat projects. And so there are a couple ways that that can be accomplished. Certainly, the rules still allow for an operator-led project, as has been done in the past. So if an operator wants to complete their own project, there's flexibility for them to do that. And they would do that in consultation with field staff, both from COGCC and CPW, and eventually through the approval process through this commission. And we would work together to ensure that all the goals of the program are being met on those operator-led projects. There's also, and this is new with the program, the opportunity to pay into a mitigation fund that's led by Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and therefore accomplish that requirement without doing the work themselves. And so in order to do that, CPW mobilized a process that would require each of the region to form a mitigation planning team, and would suggest and plan projects and prioritize projects and essentially have them in the hopper, for lack of a better word, as dollars are paid into the mitigation fund, so that projects could immediately be implemented based on that prioritization and based on the intent for the specific dollars that are paid into that program. Really, one of the things that we built this program on was the ability to have projects prepared and the opportunity to execute them as expeditiously as possible. And therefore, we intend to keep a ongoing list of projects on a variety of species and a variety of habitats based on the priorities in each region and further prioritized by oil and gas basins within each region. And then we'll talk a little bit about reporting here in a moment, but as part of the steering committee for the regional teams, we've also formed a statewide advisory group, which essentially will evaluate all of the projects and all of the funding on an annual basis. And that's the group that will provide the report to this body as well as to CPW. And along with that report will be recommendations associated with the priorities of the program. For example, if we've spent a great deal of dollars on mule deer projects in 1 year, and maybe it's a little more money that's come in for, then a little more than the money that's come in for mule deer projects, the statewide advisory group would say, you likely need to step up or slow down, excuse me, mule deer projects next year and spend that money on other species. Next slide, Karen. Thank you. And so you may recall from our hearings that one of the reasons that CPW was selected as the organization, other than an organization that certainly has expertise in habitat management and wildlife management, is that there's a statutory ability for CPW to receive compensatory mitigation dollars and spend those, not within the spending authority that's allocated each year in the long bill. And so it's a pre-made statutory allowance for CPW to execute these projects, which really facilitates the administration within Colorado Parks and Wildlife. We also set up a financial tracking management system within our financial services branch that will track each dollar that comes into this program, track what it came in for, which project it came in for, what the targeted species and habitat types are associated with each dollar that comes in. And then that will make it so that we have an ability to do financial reporting along with habitat reporting on an annual basis. And as I mentioned, there are a number of items that we will track and report on to COGCC on an annual basis, as well as stakeholders. And this is not an extensive or an exhaustive list, but a list of some of the key items that we're tracking as dollars come in. Next slide, Karen. So really the key of payment of compensatory mitigation dollars, as you'll recall, was based on direct and indirect impacts. And we had some significant conversation about direct impacts when we had these hearings. And you'll recall that we landed after a number of calculations and discussions on a payment of a flat fee of $13,750 for each project that's under 11 acres. Once they exceed 11 acres, we have individual discussions about the size and stature of those projects. Again, as I mentioned, an operator, rather than paying that fee, can complete their own compensatory mitigation project to mitigate the direct impacts. And just as a reminder, direct impacts are those impacts that are measurably direct, such as the establishment of pads and roads and other infrastructure that directly displace wildlife in any given location. There's also an opportunity for an operator to use a third-party mitigation bank. There are an increasing number of legitimate habitat exchanges where dollars are pooled and spent on species, and many of those species are species that are impacted by oil and gas development. And so there's also an opportunity for parties to pay into that mitigation bank that's not a CPW fund, so long as it's approved by CPW and by this commission. On top of the compensatory mitigation for direct impacts, certainly we had some discussion about indirect impacts as well. Indirect impacts are a little harder to calculate. And so we committed to this commission that we would come back to you and talk a little bit more about how we intend to calculate indirect impacts on a site-by-site basis. And so at this point, Mr. Chair, I'd like to turn the slides over to Dr. Voltura to help us walk through that.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerman. Look forward to hearing from you, Dr. Voltura.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to provide updates on the work that CPW has been doing since the hearings. We do talk to your staff every other week on our regular calls, so they are aware of this, but I don't think we've had this discussion with you yet. The indirect impact buffers, again, were in the rules, but were not discussed in detail at the hearing. So I wanted to provide you an update on what we've been working on with these. And as a reminder, these are the impacts that are more really about the animal's behavior and use of the habitat post-construction. So once you put these things on the landscape, roads and pads and wellheads, it isn't so much that direct loss, but how do they behave around those so that they may or may not use that habitat in the future. So it takes into account what's their avoidance buffer, basically, post-construction in the habitat. And it's looking around that the area around the disturbance no longer functions as useful habitat. So the habitat's still there, you can see it on the ground, but the animals just aren't using it because for some reason they're avoiding it. And the rule language did establish density thresholds for indirect impacts, with sort of the assumption being that based on the scientific literature and the statement of basis and purpose, that if the density is less than 1 location per square mile, that the habitat is still functional for wildlife. And then the upper limit at 5, once you exceed a density of 5 locations or 5 well pads per square mile, that the indirect impacts are so pervasive that the habitat is just, the functionality just isn't there. So we're looking really at that subset of new locations where that density falls within that range. Indirect impacts are more complicated because you're really looking at very species specific and very site specific categories. So not just how animals behave, but the actual location, not just at the well, but around it as well. We have 2 tools we're going to be utilizing to calculate these that I'll talk about just real briefly. One is a habitat quantification tool, and the other are field assessment forms that are our way to calculate these acres of impact from indirect impacts. The resulting acreage, once we do these calculations and meeting with operators, can be mitigated in the same 3 ways that were just discussed for direct impacts. The only difference is that there is no flat fee set up for indirect impacts. One of the reasons is we've not done these. We had 10 years of 2AA forms that we could look at for direct disturbance and kind of calculate average pad size, average temporary and permanent disturbance. We don't have that here. There's also some differences from locations based on the work that needs to be done and the land costs associated with it. So larger projects, smaller projects. So at least at the beginning, there really isn't any data to form any sort of flat fee. So these are going to be assessed on a project by project basis. And I want to talk real briefly about 2 examples that we're going to use. The first is a habitat quantification tool. This one example is from greater sage-grouse, and these are GIS based generally. They utilize the best available science, but they essentially model all of these things. They model the habitat. You can input your own habitat, but they're able to do things like view sheds and all sorts of GIS numbers. And they're great. They allow for consistency across sites, However, they can be very specific. You have to have a lot of data on your species. You have to have a lot of time to go into building these models. But what you do is you enter all of your field assessments, all of your numbers, all of your pad, and it kicks out what your indirect and direct impacts are. And this is showing as debits because they go one further and actually do the mitigation calculation in terms of that. What we really want to get at is what are those functional acres? Because that's really the key number we're looking at with these indirect impacts. The one, again, there is a greater sage grouse habitat quantification tool, but we have 10 species on our list of 12D and we have one tool. So what we do is we basically take that along with all of our other mitigation calculators that we can look at. So for lesser prairie chickens, for a lot of species, these calculators exist. And so we take that function, that form, that framework, and apply it to these other species. So what we've been doing is we have two teams, statewide teams. One is handling the terrestrial calculator and one is handling the grouse and prairie chicken. And they basically started with this framework. And this is actually the framework from the sage grouse HQT. And you look at, in each of these, the first step is to define the acres of impact. So we talked about species avoiding infrastructure, avoiding roads, and that is species specific. So we went into the literature and looked at pronghorn, looked at mule deer, looked at elk, looked at all of these grouse species to pull that. And that is a lot of the information that was stated in the basis and purpose and discussed when we talked about why density was important to these species. And then these subject matter experts take that and we calculate for each of these from the literature, what is their, do they avoid it by a wellhead by 400 meters? Is it by 600 meters? Is it 200 meters? And we determine that for each of these issues. And then we look at habitat quality. And again, this is where we get very site specific and species specific. But you can look at habitat conditions. So if you're in winter range, what species of habitat, what vegetation needs to be on the ground, not just that they'll eat, but that they can access in snow. So we took all of these things, all of our biologists, our terrestrial team, as well as our grouse teams, looked for each and identified what's the key factor that makes that good winter range, good production habitat. And that can also include range conditions. Is it heavily grazed? Is it pristine? All of those. Also terrain features. Elk and mule deer want cover. Bighorn sheep want 30-degree slopes. And so you had to be really specific as to what that animal uses on the terrain as part of their use of the habitat. Then we also looked at ways to categorize habitat availability, because you can have pristine habitat, but if you have roads through it, it's already got gas wells over here, it's got something else, a house over here. You want to account for that because that's not part of your indirect impact. That's already on the ground. You don't want, you want to account for that to say 75% of this really good habitat is actually available to the species, because you want to be able to include that in your acreage calculations. And then honestly, every mitigation calculator out there, it's complicated, but they all come down to your starting acres. You have some habitat quality variable that from 0 to 1. 1 is it's pristine, there's nothing else there, great habitat, everybody wants to eat there. So, you know, the lower end where it's already impacted, there's already other infrastructure on the ground, habitat's okay, it doesn't have great winter range. And then you multiply that by your starting acres, which is what the animal avoids it by in a perfect condition. And that's where you get the functional acres impacted by the project. And that really is our key metric from these calculators. So all of our species matters experts have been looking at this, putting this aside for every single species we have. And using the same framework from all of these calculators, we're working through calculating these acres. We also want to take into account the season they're constructing. If they're constructing in winter range and they want to build in winter time period, that's going to have higher impacts. You're going to have to account for that at the beginning. Also, how are they using the BMPs? If they are doing completely remote monitoring, never going to access the site in the winter, never hands-on, that makes a big difference, and we want to give credit for that to that. Also, how much of the existing infrastructure are they using or building their new? Because again, you want to credit them for following our recommendations. But in the end, again, you come down with this functional acreage, and that's the key term we're using. And one of the that, like we said, that translating to whether they choose to pay a fee, we translate it. If not, these are the acres that combined with their direct impact and is their required mitigation that we'll recommend to the commission. We have been having some pre-consultations with operators. I think we're at about over 30 right now. Just some summaries. I know the Northeast has a lot of active locations that are being looked at, about 18 in big game. And these are all preliminary. We don't know if these are actually going to go to being permits in front of you. We're just sort of, these are the conversations. And then 2 in greater prairie chicken production habitat. The Northwest is looking at about 11 locations. A lot of those are both elk and greater sage grouse overlap, so we didn't really separate those out. And then the Southwest has 2 potential locations in big game habitat. In the Southeast, we've had lots of really broad conversations. However, a lot of those were in lesser prairie chicken, and I really think that's being impacted by the proposed listing. I think operators are sort of waiting to see. So we've had these broader conversations, but nothing really site specific. And then lastly, our ongoing tasks. Again, working on the compensatory mitigation program as discussed, and these habitat planning and prioritization projects. We also have staff assigned to the riparian and biological resources working group for COGCC. And then we are working on our task, which was the migration corridors and pinch point mapping. This committee's been very active. They started meeting, I think, back in January. In terms of identifying a definition of pinch points, as well as mapping examples and looking at our existing mapped migration corridors. And that's all I had. And I think we're happy to take questions.
Great, thank you very much. Commissioners, do folks have questions? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for that presentation and overview. I thought that was good and certainly something that I'm still very interested in. So I've got a number of questions here. So I think one of the things we talked about during the mission change rulemaking was kind of the metrics around or the analysis around how you determine success with some of these projects. And I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about kind of how you determine that these are successful over what amount of time, and whether any adjustments need to be made, you know, and when that would be in the future as we start to do some of this compensatory mitigation actions.
Thank you for the question. I do think that the success of these mitigation projects really lies in the planning and setting out goals that are realistic to the environment and the conditions, but being very strategic and very specific in what it's similar to a reclamation plan. You want to get this much coverage in this many years in this, and you have to follow up. There has to be built-in schedule of monitoring, like a lot of the mitigation banks have. It really comes down to the plan and the follow-up. And I think some of them, especially in the more arid environments, are going to take longer. You know, we have to take into account that growing season and other environmental conditions are impacting that. But I think that's where it comes from, setting up a realistic plan based on all our experience and all our habitat work, is that someone can say, I can get this back to 100% in 5 years. And you know that that's an area that you know, vegetation growth just is not going to meet those conditions. So I think you follow a lot of the same thing we do with wetland banking and all of these. You look at that and you look, is that realistic? Is that timeline realistic? And you want to get it done fast, but you also want it to last on the landscape for the life of these projects. And so I think it is a balance, and it really comes into the planning, and we're counting very heavily on our habitat staff here at CPW to help us, you know, look at these, because they've done these projects and they can say that's not realistic. We need to come up with a more realistic plan that can get this done faster, or a different way to do it. So that's how I see it working.
Okay, thank you for that. So you had talked about the regional project prioritization work group and the statewide advisory group. Are these both groups that are active right now? They've been, folks been appointed to them, and they're being utilized at this point?
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. I'll take that one. And the answer to that is a little bit yes, a little bit no. We haven't had any compensatory mitigation dollars come in just yet. And so we've recently completed the program and we've identified the people that will sit on each of those regional prioritization groups. But as far as mobilizing for project planning, we've yet to do that. So we've identified the folks that will sit on that. We've identified the folks that will sit on the statewide planning or team and talk to them about their roles and responsibilities. So we're in process, but not completed process there.
And just to make sure that I understand, so the goal, well, start with the regional project prioritization work group. I imagine it's true for both of them, but one of the goals is really to create shovel-ready list of projects that tie into some master planning analysis or documents that would, you know, continually aid in the mitigation of these types of impacts. And I mean, is it important that you wait until we have mitigation dollars to do that, or is it, can we create that list of projects prior to mitigation dollars coming in, understanding that it appears that there's some in the near future?
Yes, thanks for that clarification, Commissioner Messner. And you're exactly right. I think prudent planning is, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, having projects ready and in the pipeline and ready to go. We do consistently plan and execute habitat projects, and we've got any number of those on the books right now. And so we're very familiar with planning them and executing them. We are still in the process of mobilizing each region to plan specifically for this purpose, habitat projects that'll fall into the pipeline. So yes, I agree with you. It's exactly right that we have those projects ready to go. We do not have those lists compiled specifically for this purpose yet, but are in the process of forming groups to do so.
Great, thank you. And then when these projects get developed, this pipeline of projects, is that something that we're able to see, or is it, how do we know what projects are on the docket, or is that not available for us to see?
Thanks, Commissioner Messner. Everything that we have is available for you to see at any time. And so we did not build in something specific to review those projects with this commission in the planning phase. Rather, we built in a reporting process to report what those projects were to this commission, as we felt like that was a bit of a better use of your time. But we absolutely are very willing to summarize that in any way that you would have us summarize it, or you know, present those projects on a project by project basis so you can see what's in the pipeline.
I appreciate it. I didn't mean that necessarily you had to present it to us. I just didn't know if there was a website that we could go to see the projects or something like that, if the public was perhaps interested as well.
Thanks, Commissioner Messner. I think that you know, we hadn't intended to put those on a public-facing website, but that's certainly not out of the question. As I mentioned, all of our data is well, almost all of our data is public, and we're very willing to and very much would like to tell the story of the good work that operators' dollars are doing in habitat management. And so we'll take that back and talk about that a little bit more.
Great, thanks. And I apologize for peppering you guys with questions here. I just have written a few things down that I'm interested in. So a couple of things here. So I think, remind me as we look at this like holistically and understanding the concept of avoid first, then minimize, then mitigate, particularly with CPW recommendations on this. At what point do we get to mitigate, and this particular compensatory mitigation concept versus the avoidance and minimizing piece?
I can take that or try, Commissioner Messner. I think the avoidance is the no surface occupancy. No doubt, those are species we've identified that we don't know how to mitigate that impact. So around those LECs and around those buffers. So that is our avoidance piece. You know, we certainly see the BMPs as that mitigation, which is why we included them in that in our calculations, so that if they are staying out of there entirely and in a habitat, that's avoidance. And that's avoidance and it's minimization if they can maybe go in once a week. You know, so those are all stages up to the mitigation. But having these wells on the landscape is an impact, no matter what else you do. And that's what we're mitigating in the program. So we're kind of looking at that avoidance of no surface occupancy, minimizing by all the actions you do, but there is some piece of it that is always on the landscape. And that's really where the mitigation in these habitats are, because we've shown that well density does impact their use of the habitat. And these are habitats we know how to mitigate, you know, that we know more about, and we know that we can create habitat that they'll use.
Okay. And then as far as the indirect impacts go, you know, we've got the avoidance buffer, we've got the facility density. You know, we've seen some applications now that are talking about noise and light. So I guess can you give me some examples of what those indirect impacts are, and ways to, I guess, minimize or mitigate those? And is noise and light, you know, an important indirect impact consideration, you know, as we're looking at these facilities?
Very much so. You know, we're talking about just the infrastructure on the landscape, but the more human disturbance associated with that infrastructure, the higher the impacts. So I believe we have, it's been a while since we looked at the rules, under noise, I believe LECs. Sorry. So we have noise, especially around animals that are trying to call other animals in. Obviously, we do have some noise impacts and limitations that we recommend for those. Light is just, it's pretty much pervasive, so all species. So we do have some general requirements on that, but I do think a lot of your general operating instructions and the new rules did cover some of that. So we do, but it's also human disturbance. You know, a truck coming in every day, people on site every day for non-emergency work, those type. For species, something like bighorn sheep or even elk that are more avoidant of people in some of these remote habitats, those are the indirect impacts that I think just kind of pile up.
Thank you. Last question. And I know that you chatted about it a little bit, and that the folks that are doing the mapping associated with migratory corridors and pinch points and stopovers and those type of things, you know, has been ongoing and occurring since January, which is great to hear. Any guess as to when we may start to be able to see some of those maps conceptually, or?
I think they are aiming. I think we did have at the next mapping update, which I think is January, that's what they're aiming for, December, January, at least to have a definition that's agreed upon, because this impacts more than just oil and gas, particularly a lot of our prioritization work for transportation and wildlife. And so they want to get that definition right. So they are certainly planning on having a definition and some examples of that. I don't know that we'll have everything mapped, but we're really looking at what is a sort of quintessential pinch point to build off of. So I do believe we'll have that by fall, definitely by January, but I think even possibly sooner. But they're aiming for that December, January timeframe.
Great, thank you. Thank you for answering all my questions and for being here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Commissioner Nanjapa, Commissioner McGowan, do either of you have questions? Go ahead, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Ackerman and Dr. Voltura, for the excellent presentation. That was really informative. And also want to thank Commissioner Messner for those great questions. Some of those I had as well. One other item that I was curious about is, you know, I noted that in your indirect impacts, you had some of the specific additional considerations of species-specific or site-specific impacts as it related to determining the fee. But for the direct impacts, I was curious if you had considered, you know, any additional factors that would add on to that, or if there was a reason that you considered and then decided against that. I was, just thinking about things like certain soil types, or if there was aquatic habitat nearby or that was disturbed, directly, and if that was something that was considered as part of establishing that $13,750 fee versus something else that could be fluctuating depending on factors.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. That's a great question and really illustrates the number of layers that we deal with when we talk about disturbance to wildlife. There are different disturbances based on geography, different disturbances based on species, different disturbances based on topography, and each site is different. And so Commissioner Nanjapa's question is very insightful as to what operators and what your staff has to talk about and deal with on a site-by-site basis. So in direct answer to your question, Commissioner Nanjapa, the $13,750 fee was set based on the direct impacts without really regard to species-specific impacts. And so the assumption is that that's a very direct impact, and in some cases removal, whether it be permanent or temporary, of habitat for all species. And therefore, as you intimated, there is kind of, adjusted as a bit of a catch-all habitat disturbance. Whereas indirect impacts really take into account what species are being disturbed and how can we mitigate for those species. And so, yes, the direct fee does not necessarily differentiate as much by species as the indirect analysis might.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I guess I may have just been unclear on this point, but is it possible to have both direct and indirect impacts, and therefore the flat fee plus whatever indirect impact fee that you may also determine?
Yes, that's exactly correct. Thanks, Commissioner Nanjapa. And so in many cases, that will be the case, that there will be indirect impacts on top of the direct impacts. And so the direct impact is the flat fee that was set. And then on each site-specific basis, we will, together with the operator and your staff, assess indirect impacts based on the methodology that Dr. Voltura talked about. And that payment would be, or mitigation project would be over and above the direct impact mitigation.
Okay, that's great. That's very helpful as well. I thought that was the case, but I wasn't sure. And then with respect to some of these shovel-ready projects that have been identified, and I know you sort of mentioned this in terms of projects that may there may be identification of a data deficient species with respect to oil and gas impacts, or some other types of impacts that maybe you're starting to notice and aren't sure if it's related to oil and gas or something else. Are those kinds of projects, things that could be perhaps nominated, or do you have a process that you're kind of looking at with respect to determinations in your species of greatest conservation need, so apart from these species that have already been identified for high priority habitat, et cetera? Is there a process for kind of determining when there's additional research needs that then could lead to a project to assess impacts?
Yes, to all of your questions. Thanks, Commissioner Nanjapa. We, as part of the program that we put together an application that we ourselves would fill out for every habitat project proposed under this program, but we also will make that application available to anybody, an operator or any other group that wants to submit a project that they think would be a good project for mitigation of oil and gas projects. As Dr. Voltura mentioned, we do meet with your staff every other week and discuss a lot of things, but one of the things that would be appropriate for that discussion is exactly what you bring up. We're running into recurring examples of a specific species or a specific topic or a specific subject matter that we really need to look into further. And in that case, your staff or our staff could move forward a project with that application process that would be have a research component to it that would go into the pipeline just like any other habitat project in the process.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think those are all my questions.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. Any further questions from commissioners? Commissioner Bowe, Commissioner Hackett, anything? Great questions from Commissioner Messner and Commissioner Nanjapa. Mr. Ackerman, Dr. Volterra, thank you very much for presenting to us. This has been very informational, and I know that the 49 folks that are listening in also find this to be very informational as well. So thank you very much for your great work, and keep it up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, with that, we'll continue. I think we have a presentation from Mike Leonard, our compliance manager, about inspection prioritization. So we'll bring Mr. Leonard to the panel. If we can find him. Oh, there he is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Takes a little bit to come in. Good morning, commissioners. I'm Mike Leonard, the Compliance Unit Manager here at COGCC. And it's been a while since I've talked to you, but it's always just a pleasure. As Ms. Amaro brings up the presentation, I'm here today to talk to you about prioritizing well inspections. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I'll give you a little background about our prioritization system. And then we'll talk some details about approach and implementation. I'll talk to you a little bit about some statistics, and then we'll go to moving ahead and where we are in that process. Next slide, please. So in 2013, Senate Bill 13202 was passed and amended the Oil and Gas Act with 3460-106 15.5. And this language remains unchanged today. Legislature saw the need in this based on the number of spills that were being reported and other situations like that. I want to stress the use of the words risk-based, or more pointedly, the word risk. This is the language from the bill and statute. However, the real context here is priority. In other words, just because a well has a higher number doesn't mean it's an imminent hazard, but that it needs to be inspected in a more prioritized fashion. You can see the 3 points here are the directives from the bill and the act. So the use of a risk-based strategy, prioritizing more in-depth inspections, and improving frequency and timing. Next slide, please. The desired outcome of this bill was to detect spills before they worsened, increase the public's trust in the Commission's oversight of oil and gas operations, and to better protect public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. In addition to that, we saw some agency benefits that would be having a systematic, repeatable, less subjective method, having some accountability for that process, and then to leverage the data we collect as part of the regulatory process. Next slide, please. So after the bill was passed, Commission staff conducted and published a study that resulted in 8 findings and 4 recommendations. The link to this study is at the bottom of this slide, or you can find it on the COGCC website in the Library Technical Reports section. Excuse me. I'll circle back to these a little later when we talk about the implementation of the process. Next slide, please. So to give you a little background on where we came from, in the past, inspections were prioritized with the bullets listed on this slide. However, other than complaints and incidents, which are always a priority, this was a very informal process. Inspectors were tasked with coming up with their own priority system. The only notices we received prior to this were spuds and pluggings, and those were typically delivered because of a COA on the drilling permit or the plugging permit, and they were delivered by a phone call from the operator to the inspector. And then since our inspectors live and work in their areas, they use their the knowledge as what was going on in that area to determine where and what to inspect. So as you can imagine, this resulted in varied outcomes across the state. Next slide, please. So we'll discuss the approach and development to this new system a little. The idea was to develop a repeatable system that allowed for a statistical work product. During the development, staff identified risk factors based on the recommendations from the report to the legislature, and then used other available data such as census information, spill data, corrective actions, wildlife data, water features, and some institutional knowledge were used. The institutional knowledge was more to developing calculations regarding the scoring for spills and corrective actions rather than the other data, which is geographic data, map data, things like that. Next slide, please. So this slide illustrates the factors in the scoring system, and it also weights each factor. So for instance, based on the report, older facilities had more spills. Therefore, we increased the weighting for the years in service factor. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. The database does the math based on the formula here. It seems like a fairly simple formula, but it's really not in the database. And when we rolled this out, the scores ranged from 15 to 75. Staff then looked at those ranges and determined what the priority scores would be. So at this point, I'd like to give a lot of credit, a great amount of credit, to Chris Eisinger, COGCC GIS Supervisor, and Ken Robertson, COGCC Senior Data Analyst, for their work in developing and maintaining the database system. Next slide, please. So after we developed the process, it was time to implement it. And to implement this process, we provide guidance to field staff each morning by forwarding daily reports and apply information onto map layers to allow them to schedule work. These numbers are also part of field staff's yearly performance objectives with the goal of inspecting all high priority wells annually. And just to be clear, since wells can come on and go off the list based on many factors, such as, a well wasn't 20 years old on April 1st, but on June 1st it was, which would increase its factor. We used a snapshot of high priority wells on April 1st to achieve this performance metric. And again, it's important to note that many wells come onto the list after April 1st, and they are also inspected as the information is provided. This will be evident in the statistics I'll show you here shortly. And then finally, we changed the field inspection form to assist staff in performing a more thorough inspection. Next slide, please. So these two examples are portions of the daily report sent to field staff, and each report is personalized for each staff member for their area. It's got several tabs across the bottom, and it's generated and it comes out every morning to them. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about statistics. We rolled out this process in April 1st, 2016. There were about 5,500 wells on the list that were high priority. And as you can see, that number has decreased substantially in the following years. And again, this is not just because staff has inspected over 90% of the April 1st snapshot wells, but they're also inspecting other wells that come onto the list as the year progresses. I'd like to mention the increase in the number of wells in 2018, and upon analysis, we determined we had a large number of staff openings and changes over the 2017-2018 time period. So as you can imagine, not having staff available will reduce the number of possible inspections. Also, as we bring on new staff, it takes some time to train them and allow them to get adjusted to their positions. These numbers will be visible as well in some of the following slides. Next slide, please. So this slide helps speak to recommendations 1, 3, and 4 from the study performed. And those bullets recommended more frequent inspections, more time-specific inspections, and more frequent inspections during hydraulic fracturing operations. So this stat shows that the inspection frequency has improved except for that 2017-2018 period, mostly for the reasons that I mentioned. Next slide, please. And these are the inspection numbers over the years. As I mentioned before, the number changed over the years, mostly due to staffing, and weather conditions play into this as well, especially in the wintertime when we're unable to access different parts of the state for weather events and things like that. Next slide. So I'm going to circle back to that earlier slide about findings and recommendations. There's a lot of stuff here. I didn't want to read through it and put it in here, but I've added some red text speaking to the results or outcomes of those findings and recommendations. I'd like to say, you know, the first 2 findings are really just stated facts. And then the rest of the findings, COGCC staff really took seriously, and over time has implemented a lot of processes, rules, or procedures to address them. Some of those were addressed in the recent rulemaking. As for the recommendations, we developed this priority inspection process. And again, then we moved further to change forms and implement rules to address those recommendations. I'd like to say that the red text is not in the library form, but it'll remain here in this presentation. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about moving ahead. This current priority process has been in use for about 6 years, and it's really time to revisit and renew it. Some of the things we need to think about and incorporate would be the new and revised rules, the current landscape vision, input from staff for more institutional knowledge. And we also need to make changes to the field inspection form to assist with this and other informational process. As you can imagine, this is no small task. Gathering all the necessary requirements, then working them into the database that generates a successful outcome will take some time and a great deal of effort. Next slide, please. So that brings us to where we are now. We started internal discussions and started developing some ideas. We've also brought in an external source, Jim Milne, who, a former COGCC employee, has worked extensively with Groundwater Protection Council and various other states to develop a similar process, inspection process. Jim's very familiar with the COGCC process, database, and GIS system. Again, as I mentioned, Jim held positions at COGCC, including permit tech, GIS coordinator, and environmental manager before moving on to other challenges. And so far, we've had an initial startup meeting and started gathering ideas and putting some of that institutional knowledge forward to move this process forward. Next slide. And with that, are there any questions?
Great, thank you, Mr. Leonard. I, for one, just want to acknowledge the depth of the work that has gone on here. Also want to acknowledge that, you know, this is work that was ongoing well before SB 19181. And I'd like to call on Director Murphy, if she's with us, to provide some context and perspective around all this. Oh, hello there, Director Murphy.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mike. I just so appreciate the amount of time that you put into helping all of us understand how your team really focuses its work and prioritizes it. as guided by a statute that was passed, a decade ago and continues to be really relevant, so long as we continue to iterate to it. And I think that's the most exciting next step that we're talking about, is making sure we take what we've learned over the last decade and continuing to improve that process. But Mike, really kudos to your team. The biggest context for me is I talked to Mike maybe 2 months ago and said, hey, I think this would be a really good thing to do. And he said, that's great. I just got off a call with all of my supervisors who are talking about how they want to change how we do our work in recognition of our changing, workload and priorities. And so I think I have to acknowledge that I might have suggested the presentation, but the idea to refine how the compliance unit does its work is all their own. With that, I think I turn it back over to you, Chair. And again, thank you, Mike, to you and your team.
Excellent. Are there any questions from commissioners for Mr. Leonard? Ooh, that was a tie. I'm going to go with Commissioner Nanjapa and then Commissioner McGowan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Sorry, Karen. I just had a question. So thank you first so much for the presentation. That was great and really helpful. And in particular, I found the slide with the sort of responses to the report from 2014 really helpful, kind of, understanding all of these different benchmarks that have been met so far. One thing I was curious about is how you sort of follow up on these inspections. So if you find something that requires an action by the operator, do you have a process in place, or, like a schedule that you put together for checking back in on progress, or if a subsequent form is due, or those kinds of things? Yeah, that's what I was curious about.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. And that's a great question. And that's part of the process that we're going to be working on with the field inspection form. Right now, it's corrective actions they're kind of memorialized in the priorities and the maps. And there's actually a tab on that daily sheet that lists an inspector whether a corrective action has been added to that particular well or not. But we're looking at some ways right now to make that a better tickler, if you will, and a better tracking method for that. That'll be part of not necessarily the prioritization project of it, but we've got to make some changes to the field inspection form.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Leonard, for that presentation. I think many of us have had questions on how this what happens behind the curtain. So I'm wondering how self-inspections from operators and any data they submit to you all play into any risk factors, or how you might do inspections.
So operators, thank you for the question. Operators really don't submit self-inspections. However, they don't submit them to COGCC. But part of, let's just as an example, the stormwater rules, self-inspection is part of a stormwater plan and procedure by the operator. So a lot of times we can tell while we're inspecting that they have a plan, that they've been monitoring their stormwater and things like that. But as far as inspectors submitting inspections to us, we don't have anything like that. We really rely on what our staff observes and documents when they're there.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for that response. It would be interesting to me to see if you all are interested in exploring kind of self-inspection data and how that can feed into a risk assessment. And a parallel I guess I would point out to is over at CDPHE, there are many, many dry cleaners and not enough inspectors. And so they are required to do a self-inspection annually, and it's a checklist of things that they need to attest that they have looked at and checked, and we still go out and inspect, and it has brought compliance up significantly. It's an interesting, I think, tool for us to consider with operators. So I'll just throw that out there. I'm curious to also know perhaps if we consider increased inspections if we think that there's something going on with an operator, particularly around financial status and if they're going through any sort of bankruptcy or restructuring, if we think that that's a risk factor or no. And maybe we don't see a correlation, but I'm curious.
Well, currently in the prioritization system, it's not a factor. What I have told the team that's working on the new system now is nothing's off the table. We want to hear all ideas and see how we can incorporate those. And both your self-inspection and potentially, the financial assurity or the financial whatever could be part of it. I do know that Jim's program that he helped develop for Utah, they take into production. They take production into account. And I think that's one thing that's been discussed amongst this, the commissioners and this group is, does the production of a well influence inspection priority?
Go ahead, Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you. Sorry. And this is down a whole different rabbit hole. I'm not sure I'm understanding the connection to the high priority well numbers decreasing over time. Is that because we visited more and we realized that they're not a high priority? Or I guess I'm not making a connection to why they're shrinking, because like we can't change the age of a well, for example. So could you go into that a little bit more? I think I'm missing some dots.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you. It's based on the formula and the calculation. So if a well is high priority, let's just say a well's high priority because one of the factors is the age of the well, and that might be, so the factor of age of well and time since last inspection. Once that well is inspected, that time since last inspection risk factor goes down, which then may take it off the high priority list. We do have some wells that are, there's very few of them, but we do have a few wells in the state that come back on every year just because of age and spills and things like that. The numbers actually went down because our inspectors, as they look at their map layers, they may have a well that's on their April 1st snapshot list. Let's say that, and again, they're out there July 1st and they went out to do this April 1st snapshot list, but they look on the map and they say, oh, well, these 3 other came on the list in June and they're high priority. So I'm going to inspect them. Once I inspect them, they come off of the next year's high priority list. Does that answer your question? Make sense?
I think so. Yes, I think it helps for me to understand that some of the wells are just kind of probably stubbornly, by virtue of how old they are or other factors, going to constantly be on the high priority list. And so that's all good. I think I see what you're saying. Yeah, kudos to the staff for getting through the inspections. That's really good news.
Thank you. They do a very good job. And again, going back to the priority, let's say a well is in near mapped surface water, high priority wildlife environment. It's over 20 years old. There's a pretty good chance that well, no matter how many times you inspect it, is going to come back the next year. It's just part of that process.
Further questions for Mr. Leonard? All right, seeing none, Mr. Leonard, thank you very much for that very good understanding of what's been going on in your shop. We really appreciate learning about that. That's some of the behind the scenes work that this commission continues to do that is not necessarily sort of readily apparent. And I think it's really important to bring that to the fore by this type of presentation to us. So thank you again for all of that. And thank you to all of your team. I know they do really good work, and they've continued to do really good work during these last sort of unsettling year of COVID, et cetera, with regard to all the inspections that they've been doing. So thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank
Director
you.
Murphy?
Sorry, Mike. I did want to follow up, Chair. At this commission's request, We are also planning similar updates for the other rule series and teams. Mike's just happened to be kind of the most simple to kind of get to go and kick it off with. But I think later this month and into the beginning of October, staff will be providing an update on how other teams are implementing the changes from the mission change rules at the slightly more granular level, how we're interpreting things, how we're applying things. So I hope that those are also continue to be helpful for this commission. I think those are tentatively scheduled for the 22nd of September and the 6th of October, pending availability and timing, but we are working towards providing similar information across other units.
Excellent. We look forward to those presentations as well. Okay, with that, I think we have come to our consent agenda. We have one hearing officer recommendation under Rule 505. Does any commissioner have any questions relevant to consent agenda? Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve consent agenda?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Mr. Chair, I'll second.
Okay, it looks like Commissioner Nanjapa has dropped off, but that's okay. We are still a quorum, so we can move forward with the motion and the second. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. We now have commissioner comments. Do any of the remaining commissioners have comments for the good of the cause? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to apologize to sound like a broken record, but I feel that things need to be on the agenda sooner. The consent agenda yesterday morning still just said consent, but didn't say what that agenda item was, and I had to go find it, which is fine for me, but I think is difficult for the public to figure out what's happening on our agendas. And so I think next time if something's not on a little more timely, I might not vote for it, not because I don't agree that it belongs on consent, but I feel like we're not giving people the opportunity to review things that we'll be discussing in front of the commission. And so I feel like I'm sounding like, anyway, I will leave it at that. I know that staff is busy and they're burdened and they're trying to get things on, but I feel pretty strongly about it, so.
No, I think point well taken, Commissioner McGowan. I think all of us would agree. We did receive some pushback with regard to the most recent OGDPs that weren't out in the public quick enough. And I do think that staff is definitely working toward, I'd like to see like a 10-day turnaround, like 10 days before we take something up, it's posted so that we and the public have an opportunity to take a look at it. I do see that Hearings Manager Larson has shown up. Would you like to speak to this issue? Ms. Larson?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner McGowan. And I do appreciate your comments. And we are trying to reform our processes. With respect to this last week's consent agenda, we had some folks out as a result of the holiday weekend, and there was a bit of a communication breakdown with one of our other units in getting something reviewed. So I apologize that was the reason for the delay in this last consent agenda. But we are endeavoring to ensure that our consent agenda is ready to go by Thursday of the week prior to the Wednesday hearing.
I'm very appreciative of that. Thank you.
Other commissioners with comments? Commissioner Hackett?
Thank you, Chair Robbins. Just another reminder, and this is the second time I mentioned it, I'll probably mention it again next week. The Air Quality Control Commission hearing next Friday is something folks will, I think, want to tune into. There's a couple topics that are going to be particularly relevant to this commission. One in particular at 12:30 right now, it's scheduled. There will be a briefing from the Colorado Energy Office and staff in the Air Pollution Control Division about the greenhouse gas emissions reduction roadmap. Talking about the progress made on the different industrial sector targets there. I went ahead and sent commissioners a link to the agenda, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it in the chats here. If hearing staff can help me get that out to the attendees here today, I think it would be interesting for them to attend as well. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention, Commissioner McGowan and I will be partnering to prepare a presentation to the Regional Air Quality council on October 1st at their board meeting. And Chair Robbins and I had discussed potentially taking over one of the regularly scheduled commission work sessions that Friday and allowing commissioners to attend that presentation of the Regional Air Quality Council and give them an opportunity to interact with their colleagues on that board. So I'll make sure to send you all details about that once we firm up all the specifics. But that's all I had, and thanks for the opportunity to share those thoughts.
Thank you, Commissioner Hackett. Always appreciative to have you let us know what's going on over at our sister agency. Other comments from commissioners? All right, seeing none, we have concluded our business for today, sort of a short agenda, which is fine. With that, I would look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, we're adjourned. Everybody take care.